The photograph had been in the sun visor so long it had faded to the color of old honey. A younger man stood in it, straighter, steadier cheek, the kind of man who believed the ground beneath his feet was solid. Beside him, a woman with dark hair caught mid-laugh. Between them, a little girl in red boots, squinting at the camera like the sun was in her eyes. Behind them all, a craftsman-style house with a red front door. Ray Colton pressed his thumb against the photograph's curled edge and let it spring back into place. The house in the picture was gone. Sold at a loss 3 years ago. The woman was gone too. Lynn, who had loved him passionately, then less patiently, then not at all. And Sadie, the little girl in red boots, was 20 years old now, living in a dormitory 4 states away, studying architecture because her father had once told her that buildings were the closest thing humans had to permanence. He hadn't told her that he was sleeping in his truck. The Ford F-150 smelled of stale fast food wrappers and the industrial soap from the truck stop bathroom, where he cleaned up every morning before anyone could see him. He had memorized the schedule of every 24-hour parking lot within a 15-mile radius of downtown Columbus, which ones had security guards who came around at 2 in the morning, which ones had lights bright enough to read, by which ones were quiet enough that a man might actually sleep. Tonight, he was in the far corner of a Walmart lot, a Tuesday in September, cool enough that he needed the sleeping bag, but not cold enough to run the engine for heat. He had $1.13 in his checking account. He had a cracked phone screen, a drafting pencil behind his ear out of habit, and 48 years of a life that had come apart so slowly he hadn't noticed until there was nothing left to hold. This was what rock bottom looked like, he had decided. Not dramatic, not cinematic. Just a middle-aged man in a parking lot watching a couple walk to their car, laughing about something he couldn't hear heading home to a place that was theirs. He had been a respected architect once, not famous, not wealthy in any way that lasted, but respected, the kind of man other professionals called when they needed someone who understood old buildings, who could look at a structure that had been standing since before electricity and figure out how to bring it forward without destroying what made it worth saving. He had built his firm over 15 years, one careful project at a time. Historic renovations mostly. Small developers and private home owners who wanted something done right. Then the regional housing market had collapsed. Not the national crash everyone remembered. This was smaller, quieter, more personal, a regional contraction that hit Ohio's secondary markets hard and fast and without warning. Projects canceled overnight. Clients stopped calling. Ray had tried to pivot, had bid on commercial work he had no passion for, had cut his rates until the numbers no longer made sense. The firm he had built over 15 years dissolved in less than 18 months. Lynn had tried to hold things together. She had been patient in a way that cost her something. But savings have a bottom, and so does patience. And when both ran out at roughly the same time, she had packed a bag and driven to her sister's place in Tennessee. The divorce was fast and remarkably civilized, which Ray had decided was either a sign of how little was left to fight over or how little fight was left in either of them. He had kept the truck and his drafting equipment. She had kept what remained of their savings. Sadie had kept her composure in a way that broke his heart. She had been 18 when it all came apart, old enough to understand, young enough that understanding it cost her more than it should have. She had chosen her college, partly he suspected, because it was far enough away that she didn't have to watch him fail in real time. Now she called every Sunday, cheerful, busy, building a life with the focused determination of someone who had decided that the best response to instability was motion. Ray had not told her about the truck. He had told her he was staying with a friend while he figured things out. The lie had been small at first, a temporary shelter from a truth he intended to solve quickly. 3 months later, the lie had grown into something that lived in his chest like a splinter he couldn't reach. He picked up his phone. The screen had cracked 2 weeks ago when he dropped it on asphalt reaching for his coffee. Spiderweb fractures spread from the lower right corner, but it still worked. He had developed a nightly ritual, scrolling through rental listings. He couldn't afford job postings that required a permanent address. He didn't have anything that might show him a door. Most nights there were no doors. He scrolled through the rental listings first. Studios in Columbus were running $1,200 a month minimum. He had $37 in cash in the glove compartment and $1.13 in the bank in a day labor job at a construction site starting at 6 the next morning that would pay him $90 in cash if he showed up and worked. He switched to a construction job forum he checked sometimes for leads. And then, almost by accident, his thumb stopped. It was buried 3 pages deep in a thread about estate auctions, the kind of thread that started as something useful and gradually filled up with off-topic posts and spam. Someone had dropped a link with no explanation. Ray almost scrolled past it. Something made him tap it instead. The website that loaded looked like it had been built in 2003 and never updated. White background, Times New Roman font, a header that read Harwick County Estate Auctions online bidding portal. There was one active listing, Victorian Mansion constructed 1883, Greystone Falls, Ohio, 2.4 acres. As is where is condition. Being sold to satisfy outstanding estate tax obligations. Starting bid $1. Auction closes midnight tonight. Ray looked at the time, 11:13 p.m. He looked back at the listing. There were 3 photographs, small and poorly lit. The first showed a 3-story Victorian structure with a wraparound porch listing badly to one side. The second showed a wall of broken windows on the upper floor, dark openings staring out like empty eye sockets. The third showed the front entrance, a massive oak door, paint peeling, surrounded by carved woodwork, so detailed it was visible even through the bad photography. Ray sat up straighter. He had spent 15 years looking at old buildings. He knew what decay looked like. He also knew what it was hiding. And what he could see in those 3 small photographs, even through the neglect, even through the damage, was craftsmanship. Real craftsmanship. The kind that required skill and intention and money and time. Somebody had built this structure with a specific ambition of permanence. He checked the auction details. 3 bids, all at the $1 minimum. No competing interest. The listing note said the property had been in legal limbo for decades, disputed inheritance, unpaid taxes, and the county had finally foreclosed and listed it simply to clear it from the books. No warranties, no guarantees, no inspection reports, no interior photographs. Ray looked at his bank balance, $1.13. He thought about the $90 he would earn tomorrow if he showed up at 6 in the morning. He thought about the $37 in the glove compartment. He thought about the fact that even if he won this auction, he had no money for repairs, no tools beyond what was in the truck bed, no plan for what came next. And then his phone rang. Sadie's name appeared on the cracked screen. He answered immediately. It was late for her to be calling, and worry moved faster than reason. "Hey, Belle." He had called her that since she was small, short for the second half of her middle name, which was Lynn's mother's name, which Sadie had decided she preferred at age 4 and had not reconsidered since. "Hi, Dad." Her voice was tired, the particular tiredness of someone who had been pushing hard and was starting to feel the edge of it. "I know it's late. I just wanted to hear your voice." "Everything okay? Midterms?" "Yeah, it's fine. It's just—" She stopped, started again. "I was thinking today about the house, the one with the red door. Do you remember that smell, like old wood and coffee and whatever Mom used to bake on Sunday mornings?" Ray closed his eyes. "I remember," he said. "I miss when things made sense." She said it simply without self-pity, which made it worse. "I know that's not a useful thing to say. I just miss it." They talked for 18 minutes. Sadie described a professor who assigned readings with apparent contempt for the concept of sleep. She described a project she was working on, a redesign of a mid-century commercial building that her studio class had been given as an exercise. She was excited about it. Ray could hear the excitement underneath the exhaustion, and it was the best sound he had heard in months. After they hung up, he sat in the darkness for a long time. He thought about Sadie in her dormitory working on her project, building something. He thought about Lynn in Tennessee, presumably building something too. He thought about the 15 years of work that had dissolved in the 3 months of parking lots, in the $37 in the glove compartment. And then he looked at his phone. 11:41 p.m., 19 minutes until the auction closed. He thought about the photographs, the carved woodwork, the bones of a building that had been standing for over a century and was still standing, which meant it had survived things. Storms, decades of neglect, the slow erasure of everyone who had known what it was. He thought about Sadie asking if he remembered the smell of the house with the red door. He thought, what if a man with nothing left to lose placed a dollar bet on the possibility that things could be different? His thumb moved to the bid button. He paused. He thought about the $90 tomorrow. He thought about chaos as. He thought about the way desperation could dress itself up as inspiration, and how many times he had watched other people make decisions from the bottom of a hole and call it hope. Then he pressed the button. The screen confirmed his bid. $1, Ray Colton, Columbus, Ohio, high bidder. He set the phone on the passenger seat and stared at the Walmart parking lot. The lot lights hummed overhead. A shopping cart sat at an angle near the cart return, not quite in, not quite out. A man in a reflective vest walked the perimeter of the building with his hands in his pockets. At 11:54 p.m., his phone chimed. Congratulations. You are the winning bidder for Lot 4471, Whitmore Estate, Greystone Falls, Ohio. Please contact the Harwick County Attorney's Office within 72 hours to complete transfer documentation. Ray read the email 4 times. Nobody had outbid him. In the final 13 minutes, with a historic Victorian mansion on the table, not a single other person had raised the stakes above $1. He sat in his truck in the parking lot and held his cracked phone in both hands and felt for the first time in 3 months something other than the flat gray weight of days moving forward without direction. He could not have named what he felt. It was too complicated and too fragile to be called hope. It was more like the moment before hope, the moment when a person realizes that something has shifted, that the floor they had been standing on was not, after all, the lowest floor. He did not sleep. He spent the rest of the night on his phone reading everything he could find about Greystone Falls and the Whitmore estate. The town sat in Harwick County, about 4 hours southwest of Columbus, in the part of Ohio that the economy had been quietly leaving behind for 40 years. Population 2,847 at the last census, though everyone who quoted that number seemed to believe the real figure was lower. One main employer, a grain processing plant on the south edge of town that had been running at half capacity since the previous decade. The Whitmore mansion appeared occasionally in digitized county records. Built 1883, original owner listed as Edmund Whitmore. After Edmund's death in 1897, the property had passed through a tangle of inheritance disputes that seemed to have consumed most of the 20th century. The county had finally moved to foreclose on unpaid taxes sometime in the past year. Ray found the mansion on satellite maps. It sat on the northeast edge of Greystone Falls, at the end of a long gravel drive surrounded by fields that had gone to high grass and scrub. The structure's footprint was enormous, at least 5,000 square feet from the aerial view, possibly more. He could see missing sections of roof and what looked like a collapsed section of the rear wing. He was on the road by 4 a.m. The drive took just over 4 hours. The truck complained at highway speeds, a rattle in the engine block that Ray had been ignoring for 2 months because he couldn't afford to address it. He stopped once for gas outside of Dayton, counting bills with the focused precision of someone who had learned exactly how much each dollar weighed. He bought a protein bar and ate it while driving. The landscape changed as he drove west and south. Columbus gave way to flat farmland, which gave way to rolling hills covered in the particular tired green of an Ohio September. Towns grew smaller and farther apart. Grain elevators appeared on horizons. Church steeples marked clusters of houses that were barely large enough to call villages. Then a green highway sign weathered almost past, reading Greystone Falls, 3 miles. The downtown was 3 blocks long. A diner with a hand-painted sign, a hardware store with a truck parked at an angle out front, a barber shop, a pharmacy. Half the storefronts on the main street had brown paper in their windows. The old movie theater had been converted into something called the Harwick Antique Exchange, its marquee letters rearranged to advertise a sale that appeared to have ended 6 months ago. Ray found the county attorney's office in a narrow brick building wedged between a hardware store and what had once been a bank. Inside, a woman at a reception desk looked up from her work with barely concealed surprise. "I have an appointment about the Whitmore property," Ray said. Her eyebrows moved slightly upward. "You're the buyer." It was not quite a question. The attorney was a man in his early 70s named Gaines, Arthur Gaines, according to the nameplate on his desk, with white hair, careful eyes, and the deliberate movements of someone who had learned long ago that patience was more efficient than speed. He shook Ray's hand with a firm grip and studied him for a moment without speaking. "I'll be honest with you," Gaines said, settling into his chair. "In 40 years of county law, I have never sold a property for $1. I want to make sure you understand what you're getting." As is, Ray said. No warranties, no guarantees. I read the listing. It's more than that. Gaines folded his hands on the desk. The property has been empty since the mid-90s. Before that, the last occupant was a woman named Miriam Whitmore, a distant relation of the original family who held a life estate. She died in 1975. Since then, the property has been in legal limbo, contested between various heirs, none of whom could agree on anything, and most of whom have since died themselves. The county inherited the problem. He paused. There are no remaining liens, no outstanding claims beyond the back taxes which are folded into the sale. Once you sign, it's yours, free and clear. Ray signed. Gaines slid a key across the desk. Old iron heavy with a bow shaped like a simple loop. One piece of advice, the attorney said. Have someone look at the structure before you go inside. I had an inspector assess it about 12 years ago who said the foundation was sound, but that was 12 years ago. Ray pocketed the key. Its weight felt significant, real, like a fact. The mansion was 3 miles outside town at the end of a gravel drive so overgrown that Ray had to get out of the truck twice to move fallen branches. He came around a bend in the drive and stopped. Even knowing what the photographs had shown, the reality was something else entirely. The house rose 3 full stories against a September sky that had gone the color of pewter. Victorian architecture at its most ambitious, the wraparound porch, the peaked dormers, the tower on the northeast corner, the carved woodwork along every eave and gable. Once this would have been the finest house in Harwood County, possibly the finest house for 50 miles in any direction. Now the porch sagged at a 30-degree angle on the south side. Broken windows stared from the upper floors like holes punched through the face of something that had once been beautiful. Vines had consumed the entire east wall from foundation to roofline. Roof tiles were missing in long, irregular patches, and in one section of the rear wing, the roof appeared to have failed entirely. Ray sat in the truck with the engine running and looked at it for a long time. He thought about driving away. The thought was genuine. He could turn around, drive back to Columbus, call Gaines in the morning, and explain that he had made a mistake and figure out what happened to a property when its $1 owner walked away. He could go back to the parking lot at the Walmart, back to the day labor jobs, back to Sunday phone calls with Sadie where he said everything was fine. He turned off the engine and got out of the truck. The front steps groaned under his weight but held. Ray tested each board before trusting it, his body moving through the familiar calculus of structural assessment without needing to think about it. The porch was worse than it looked from the drive. The decking had rotted through in 3 separate sections, and the south support column had failed at the base. But the bones were there. The frame was old-growth, timber-dense, and resistant, just weathered beyond the point where most people would bother. The iron key turned stiffly in the lock. The door swung inward with a sound that Ray would later describe to Sadie as the house introducing itself. The entry hall was immense. A staircase swept upward to the second floor, its banister carved with a running vine pattern that was visible even under decades of accumulated dust and grime. The ceiling soared 15 feet overhead, interrupted by plaster molding that would cost a small fortune to replicate today. A chandelier hung from the center half, its crystal drops missing the remaining ones coated in gray. Wallpaper hung from the walls in long strips, water damage blooming through the plaster beneath. The hardwood floor was warped and buckled in several places, the wood dark with moisture. Every surface held a layer of accumulated years' dust. Debris, the evidence of birds and small animals who had found their way in through the broken windows. Ray walked through the ground floor in something close to silence. Parlor, formal dining room with a plaster ceiling still intact. Butler's pantry, a kitchen with a wood-burning range that had not been used in 50 years. A library with built-in shelves on 3 walls empty, now the wood darkened with age. A study with paneled walls and built-in cabinets. A small conservatory on the east side whose glass panels had shattered and been replaced over the years by vines and weather. Despite everything, despite the damage and the neglect and the sheer overwhelming scale of what would need to be done, Ray's assessment kept arriving at the same conclusion. The bones were good, the walls were plumb, the floors, damaged as they were solid hardwood beneath the grime. The structure had been built by someone who understood load-bearing capacity and material quality, and the relationship between craftsmanship and time. Whoever Edmund Whitmore had been, he had not built cheaply. Ray found himself in the library. He stood at the center of the room and turned slowly, looking at the empty shelves, the darkened wood, the broken window someone had patched decades ago, with a square of cardboard that had itself disintegrated. In the corner of the room, pushed against the wall and half hidden behind a fallen shelf, he saw something. A hand pump. The old-fashioned cast-iron kind, with a long handle and a spout that curved over a stone basin set into a wooden counter. He crossed to it and placed his hand on the handle, pressed down. Nothing happened. He pressed again, harder. The mechanism groaned, a deep protesting sound of metal that had not moved in years. He pressed a third time, putting his weight into it. Water came. Rust brown at first, then clearing, running cold and steady into the stone basin. Ray stood at the pump and let the water run over his hand and did not move for a long time. It was such a small thing. A hand pump in an abandoned house finding water that had been waiting underground while the world above it fell apart. But in that moment, with cold water running clean over his fingers, something shifted in Ray Colton's chest. He was going to stay. He did not yet know what that meant. He did not know how he would eat or how he would make money or whether this impossible house could be made livable before the Ohio winter arrived. He did not know what he would tell Sadie or how he would explain a decision that could not be explained rationally. But he was going to stay. He retrieved his sleeping bag and his camp stove and his toolbox from the truck. He chose the library as his first base. It seemed the most structurally sound of the rooms he had seen, and its single broken window was small enough to cover. He swept the floor with a broken-handled broom he found in the pantry. He blocked the window with a sheet of cardboard from the truck bed. By the time the September sun set over Greystone Falls, Ray Colton had shelter. Damaged, cold, impossible shelter. But 4 walls and a roof and a hand pump that brought up clean water. He called Sadie that night. He sat on the library floor with his back against the wall and his sleeping bag around his shoulders, in the camp lantern throwing yellow light across the empty shelves, and he told his daughter the truth. Not all of it. He chose the version that was honest without being cruel. He told her about the apartment, about the 3 months in the truck, about the auction and the drive in the house. The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that he checked to make sure the call hadn't dropped. "Dad?" Her voice was careful, controlled. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you're in school, because you're building something, because you didn't need to carry what I was carrying." "You're my father." "I know. Are you—" She stopped, started again. "Are you okay, really?" Ray looked around the dark library, at the peeling walls and the empty shelves and the single cardboard-covered window and the camp lantern holding back the dark. "I think I might actually be getting there," he said. And for the first time in months, the sentence did not feel like a lie. The next morning, Ray woke before dawn to the sound of the house settling. Creaks and groans in the walls, the particular language of old timber adjusting to temperature change. He lay in his sleeping bag and stared at the library ceiling plaster intact, decorated along the edges, with a simple repeating pattern that someone had painted a long time ago in colors he could no longer identify under the grime. He washed his face at the hand pump. The cold water was a shock that arrived exactly like clarity. He needed money. He needed to assess the house properly. He needed supplies. He needed in some ordered sequence to figure out how each of those problems connected to the others. He drove into Greystone Falls and found Briggs Hardware on the main street, a square brick building with a hand-painted sign and a truck parked out front that turned out to belong to the owner. Walt Briggs was a man near Ray's age, with the broad hands of someone who had worked with them for 30 years and the direct manner of someone who had stopped caring what people thought of him sometime in middle age. He looked at Ray across the hardware counter with the undisguised curiosity of a man in a small town who already knew exactly who Ray was. "You're the fellow who bought the Whitmore place," Walt said. "Word travels. This is Greystone Falls." Walt said it the way a person states the fact that explains everything. He studied Ray for a moment, not unkindly but thoroughly. "You planning to flip it? Planning to live in it?" Walt was quiet for a moment. "With what utilities?" "Working on it." Walt leaned against the counter. "Edmund Whitmore built that house," he said finally. 1883. "My grandfather's grandfather knew him or knew of him. He was one of the good ones. Did right by people when most folks in his position didn't." He paused. "Just thought you should know what you've got." They talked for a few minutes about the house, about the town, about the kind of work a restoration like that would require. Walt mentioned almost as an afterthought that he had part-time hours available if Ray needed steady income while he got his footing. $12 an hour, 20 hours a week, not much, but regular. Ray said he would think about it. He came back the next morning and said yes. That evening, as the light went amber over the Whitmore property and Ray was boarding windows on the ground floor, meditative work, measuring and cutting and driving screws, each secured panel making the house feel incrementally more like shelter, he heard footsteps on the gravel drive. Agnes Tully arrived carrying a loaf of bread wrapped in a kitchen towel. She was in her early 70s, steel gray hair pulled back in a severe bun, wearing a canvas jacket and the expression of someone who had decided years ago that life was too short for unnecessary softness. She looked at Ray for a long moment, looked at the house, looked at the boards over the windows. "I'm your neighbor," she said. "Agnes Tully. I live at the white farmhouse with the green roof about a quarter-mile that direction." She extended the bread. "Figured you probably don't have much in the way of food." Ray took it. "That's very kind." "It's bread," Agnes said, not unkindly, but her eyes were careful, measuring. "You should know this house has a reputation in town. People call it cursed, haunted, all the usual foolishness people attach to old things they don't understand." "I'm not afraid of ghosts," Ray said. Something shifted in Agnes's expression, not quite a smile, more like the beginning of a decision being made. "Good," she said. She turned to leave, then stopped. "I want to see what kind of man you are before I say anything more. Some things need to be earned." She looked back at him once briefly. "But I'm watching." After she left, Ray sat on the front steps with the bread in his lap and ate slowly, watching the last light fade from the sky above the Whitmore property. The bread was fresh, warm inside the crust, probably the best thing he had eaten in 3 months. He thought about Walt Briggs saying Edmund Whitmore was one of the good ones. He thought about the house's strange architecture, the way certain rooms seemed smaller than they should be, the unusual placement of the basement access, the secondary doors that opened onto unexpected spaces. He thought about the word Agnes had used, reputation. He went back inside, walked to the study, opened the desk drawer. The brass compass sat exactly where he had found it the day before, small, tarnished, heavier than it looked. He turned it over in his palm. The engraving on the back was worn but legible. True North. Ray stood in the darkening study holding a dead man's compass and felt something he had not felt in longer than he could precisely remember. Not hope, not yet. But the thing that comes before hope, the moment a man realizes he is standing at the beginning of something rather than the end. He closed his hand around the compass and held it. Outside, September wind moved through the high grass of the Whitmore property. The house settled around him with its familiar sounds. And Ray Colton, 48 years old, 3 months homeless owner of a Victorian mansion he had purchased for $1, stood in the dark and let himself believe carefully, provisionally, against all available evidence that he had come to the right place. The first week taught Ray Colton the difference between a house and a building. A building was structure, load-bearing walls, roof pitch, foundation depth, the mechanical logic of materials assembled against gravity and weather. Ray had understood buildings since he was 22 years old, sitting in his first architecture studio, learning to read a structure the way a doctor reads an X-ray, looking past the surface to the system underneath. A house was something else. A house had memory. It held the shape of the lives that had moved through it, the decisions that had been made inside its walls, the weight of what people had carried in and what they had left behind. Ray had believed this for years as a professional principal. Standing in the Whitmore mansion at 6 in the morning, with cold water from the hand pump running over his face, he was beginning to understand it as something more personal. This house remembered things. He could feel it in the way certain rooms resisted him, not structurally, but atmospherically. The study on the ground floor, with its dark paneled walls and built-in cabinets, had a quality of stillness that felt different from simple vacancy. The library where he slept carried something that he could only describe as patience. And the basement, which he explored on the third morning with a flashlight and careful feet, had a layout that made no sense by any conventional architectural logic he had ever studied. The basement of a Victorian house of this size should have been straightforward. Full foundation, central furnace area, storage rooms along the perimeter. What Ray found instead was a space that had been deliberately complicated walls in unexpected places, ceiling heights that varied without structural reason, a floor plan that seemed designed to confuse rather than serve. He stood in the basement with his flashlight moving across the walls and felt his architect's mind working the problem the way it always had, assembling observations into patterns, looking for the intention beneath the apparent disorder. And then he found the door. It was behind a collapsed shelf unit in the northeast corner, a low door barely 4 feet high set into the foundation wall with the kind of iron hardware that had not been manufactured since the 19th century. The shelf unit had fallen across it at some point, probably decades ago, and in falling had created the impression that there was nothing behind it worth investigating. Ray moved the debris carefully. The door was unlocked. It opened onto a passage, narrow, low-ceilinged, running roughly northward beneath the footprint of the front parlor above. He followed it with a flashlight, ducking his head until it ended at a second door that opened into what had once been a root cellar, a separate exterior structure set partially into the hillside, accessible from the outside through a set of wooden doors that had rotted to near invisibility under decades of overgrowth. Ray stood in the root cellar and looked back along the passage he had come through. Someone had built this deliberately, not as a convenience, not as a quirk of Victorian construction. This was design movement, a way to move a person from the interior of the house to the exterior grounds without being seen from any window or road. He went to the town library that afternoon. The Greystone Falls Public Library occupied a small brick building 3 blocks from Briggs Hardware. Its interior divided into 3 rooms that smelled of old paper and radiator heat. The librarian, a quiet woman in her 60s named Mrs. Pell, directed him to the local history section without asking questions, which Ray appreciated. He spent 3 afternoons there over the following week. Edmund Whitmore had been born in Philadelphia in 1841, the second son of a prosperous merchant family. He had studied law at the University of Pennsylvania, but never practiced. By his mid-20s. He had become deeply involved in the abolitionist movement, and after the Civil War ended, his energies had shifted toward what the period newspapers described with a careful vagueness as assistance work and relief efforts for displaced persons. He had moved to Greystone Falls in 1882 and begun construction of the mansion in 1883. The local newspaper archives, digitized and accessible through the library's aging computer terminal, mentioned Edmund Whitmore occasionally across the 1880s and 1890s. Donations to the county school, contributions to the Methodist Church, service on civic committees. But scattered through these ordinary civic records were references of a different kind, phrased carefully in the coded language of an era that understood the difference between what could be printed and what could not. A friend to travelers, known for his hospitality to those seeking new beginnings. A man whose door was open to all who came in need. Ray leaned back from the computer terminal and looked at the water-stained ceiling of the Greystone Falls Public Library and felt the architecture of the Whitmore mansion rearrange itself in his understanding. The hidden passage in the basement, the root cellar with its exterior doors, the secondary entrances he had noticed on the ground floor, the rooms that were smaller than they should have been. The basement layout designed to confuse a casual observer. Edmund Whitmore had built a house with a second purpose, and he had built it well enough that a century and a quarter later, a desperate architect sleeping on the library floor had needed 3 days of research to begin to understand what he was looking at. Ray drove back to the mansion that evening with the kind of focus he had not felt in years. He worked through the ground floor systematically, measuring rooms against their exterior dimensions, identifying spaces that did not account for their square footage. He found 2 more hidden areas, a narrow compartment behind the kitchen pantry, accessible through a section of false shelving, and a space beneath the main staircase that was accessible only through a panel in the understair storage closet. Both were empty. Both were exactly the size of a space designed to hold a person. He stood in the staircase space with his flashlight and thought about what it meant to build hiding places into the bones of your house, to make concealment a structural feature, to decide that the most important function a building could serve was the protection of people who had nowhere else to go. He thought about $1.13 and a truck in a Walmart parking lot. The study was the last room he examined that evening. He had spent time in the study before it was where he had found the brass compass, and he returned to it regularly with the vague sense that the room was offering him something he had not yet learned to see. The paneled walls were dark with age, the built-in cabinets empty, the single window facing west, throwing the last of the afternoon light across the floor in a long rectangle. The wall paneling ran vertically throughout the room. Vertical boards of quarter sawn oak fitted tight, a standard treatment for a study of this period in quality. Except for one section, behind the built-in bookshelf on the north wall, the boards ran horizontally. It was the kind of detail that disappeared unless you were looking for it, and even then you had to be close enough to see the grain direction change. Ray had noticed it on his second evening in the study and filed it away. Now he pulled the empty bookshelf away from the wall, years of accumulated dust cascading to the floor in a gray wave. Up close, the horizontal boards had a different quality. The fit was tighter, the surface slightly smoother, as if it had been protected from the same weathering that had aged the rest of the room. And along the right edge, barely visible, a seam. Ray ran his fingers along it. No latch, no hinge visible from this side. He pressed different sections of the board, working systematically from bottom to top, testing for any give. Nothing. He stepped back. There had to be a release mechanism somewhere external to the panel itself. Victorian concealed rooms of this type, and he had read about them, had even encountered two in his years of restoration work, though never one as elaborate as what he suspected this might be, typically used a trigger hidden in plain sight. Something decorative, something that would not attract attention precisely because it looked like it belonged. He studied the surrounding woodwork, the carved molding along the ceiling edge, the decorative pilasters framing the bookshelf alcove, the ceiling medallion above the central light fixture. And then he saw it. Along the crown molding above the bookshelf, there were carved rosettes at regular intervals, decorative elements that appeared throughout the room, a repeating motif that his eye had cataloged and dismissed as standard Victorian ornament. But one of them, positioned directly above the center of the hidden seam, was slightly different. The carving was the same pattern. The scale was the same. But it sat at a marginally different depth than the others, proud of the surface by perhaps 2 millimeters, just enough to press. Ray climbed onto the empty bookshelf, reached up, pressed the rosette firmly with his thumb. He felt it give, a soft resistance and then a click. Mechanical, precise, the sound of something that had been waiting a very long time to be used. The section of wall swung inward. Not dramatically, not with any cinematic flourish. Just a 3-foot section of paneling pivoting on a concealed hinge, opening inward by about an inch before stopping. Ray climbed down from the shelf, pulled the panel open fully. Behind it was darkness. He raised his flashlight. The space beyond the panel was approximately 8 feet deep and 6 feet wide, small enough to feel intimate, large enough to be purposeful. The walls were finished plaster, not rough foundation stone. The floor was wood swept clean. The ceiling was nearly 7 feet, which meant whoever had designed this room had not intended it to be merely a hiding space. They had intended it to be a place where a person could live, if briefly, with some measure of dignity. There was a desk against the far wall. On its surface, held in place by a heavy glass inkwell, a collection of papers. On the walls, 3 framed pictures. On 2 of the side walls, shelves, and on the shelves, books. Dozens of them. Leather-bound intact, their spines visible in the flashlight beam. Ray stepped inside. The air had the particular quality of a sealed space, not stale exactly, but still. Undisturbed. He moved to the desk and leaned close to the papers without touching them, reading by flashlight. The handwriting was elegant and controlled the penmanship of a man who had been educated when penmanship was considered a reflection of character. April 14th, 1889. The Morrison family arrived this evening, husband, wife, 3 children, the youngest not yet 6 years old. They had been traveling for 11 days. I provided them with provisions, clean clothing, and directions to the next station north. The youngest, a girl, fell asleep at the kitchen table before she had finished eating. I carried her to the room myself. What we do in darkness, history will judge in light. Ray's hands were not entirely steady when he reached for his phone. He photographed everything. Wide shots of the room, close shots of the desk, the papers, the books, the artwork on the walls. He photographed the mechanism on the back of the panel door, the construction of the shelving, the quality of the plaster walls. He photographed each page of the journal entries visible on the desk without disturbing their arrangement. He spent 2 hours in the room and emerged into the study with the particular feeling of a man who has been somewhere that has changed the proportion of things. He called Priscilla Marsh the next morning. He had gotten her name from Walt Briggs, who had mentioned the Greystone Falls Historical Preservation Society in passing, the way people in small towns mention civic organizations as background furniture. Always there, rarely noticed. Priscilla Silla, she said immediately when she answered, was the Society's preservation coordinator. Her voice on the phone had the controlled efficiency of someone who had learned to manage her own enthusiasm. I recently purchased the Whitmore Mansion, Ray said. I found some items inside that may be of historical significance. There was a pause. You actually bought that place? I did. Another pause longer. What kind of items? Documents? Personal journals? Correspondence? Books first editions, some with inscriptions. Artwork on the walls. Everything appears to be from the late 19th century. And there's a room. He stopped. Started again. There's a concealed room that I believe has been sealed since the 1890s. The pause this time was different in quality. I'll be there tomorrow morning, Sillimarsh said. 8 o'clock. She arrived at 7:50 with 3 colleagues. She introduced efficiently Dr. Bertrice Fallow from the History Department at Ohio State's regional campus, a compact woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead in the focused manner of someone permanently mid-thought. A documents archivist named Howard Sloan, who carried his equipment in a case that looked like it belonged to a surgeon, and an art history professor from the same campus whose name Ray immediately forgot because she said almost nothing for the first 2 hours and simply looked at things with an intensity that made looking seem like a physical act. Scylla stood in the study doorway and watched Ray press the rosette. When the panel swung open, she made a sound that was not quite a word. She stepped into the hidden room slowly, the way a person enters a space they are afraid of disturbing. She moved to the desk, leaned close to the journal entries, read for a long moment without speaking. Then she straightened and turned to Ray with an expression he recognized. He had worn it himself in the basement passage in the root cellar at the hidden panel. The expression of someone recalibrating. We always suspected, she said quietly. There were references in the county records. The language was careful, but the pattern was there. Edmund Whitmore assisted people, displaced families, people looking for safety, people starting over after the war. But we never had primary source documentation. She looked at the journal on the desk. This is primary source documentation. Dr. Fallow and Howard Sloan worked for 5 days. Ray watched them when he was not working at Briggs Hardware. The work there was steady and uncomplicated, which was what he needed. He stocked shelves and cut lumber and mixed paint and used his lunch breaks to drive back to the mansion and observe the careful, methodical process of people who understood how to handle things that were old and fragile and irreplaceable. The journal spanned 1883 to 1897, the full period of Edmund's residence in Greystone Falls. Written in a clear, disciplined hand, they documented over 200 individuals and families, recording names, dates, circumstances, and destinations. Some entries were brief and logistical. Others ran for pages, capturing the texture of specific encounters, a family's fear, a child's confusion, the particular quality of gratitude from people who had learned not to trust it too quickly. One entry from 1891 held Ray longer than the others. He read it standing in the hidden room while Dr. Fallow worked quietly at the shelving behind him. I am often asked why I continue this work when the war is long over, when the formal structures of oppression have been legally dismantled. But freedom on paper is not freedom in practice. These families still flee persecution, still seek safety, still need allies willing to act rather than simply sympathize. My father's wealth built this house. I choose to use it for something that matters. The artwork on the walls included 3 original prints by Winslow Homer maritime scenes, small but unmistakably his work. A small oil painting that the art history professor examined for 20 minutes before exhaling slowly. 43 first edition volumes, several with inscriptions from their authors. On the 5th day, Dr. Bertrice Fallow sat down with Ray at the kitchen table and placed her hands flat on the surface and looked at him with the directness of someone who had decided that the kindest thing was clarity. Everything is authentic, she said. The journals, the correspondence, the artwork, the books. All genuine, all significant. She paused. The artwork alone, the Homer prints, the oil painting, the period pieces could bring between $2 and $3 million at auction. The books another 400 to 500,000. The documents are harder to value in market terms, but as historical artifacts, we're discussing potentially another million or more. Ray looked at the table. We're talking about a collection worth approximately $5 million, Dr. Fallow said, found in a house you purchased for $1. The number sat in the kitchen of the Whitmore mansion like a physical object. $5 million. Ray turned it over in his mind the way he had turned over the brass compass, feeling its weight, trying to understand what it meant. Dr. Fallow continued, I want to say something else, and I want to say it carefully. She chose her words with the precision of someone who had spent her career understanding the difference between fact and interpretation. This collection tells a story. It documents real people, real courage, real history that has been lost. If it's broken apart and sold to private collectors, that story fragments. It becomes decorative. If it's preserved intact, housed properly studied, made accessible, it becomes something that educates, something that matters beyond its monetary value. Ray looked at her. You're asking me to give up $5 million. I'm asking you to consider what Edmund Whitmore would have wanted, Dr. Fallow said. He preserved these things deliberately. He kept this record for a reason that had nothing to do with money. She was quiet for a moment. The question is whether you can afford to honor that reason. Ray drove into Greystone Falls that afternoon with the number still sitting in his chest. He was in the hardware store restocking a display of exterior paint when the bell above the door rang, and Walt Briggs looked up from the register, and his expression changed in a way that Ray noticed before he turned around. The man who walked in wore a suit that cost more than Ray's truck. He was in his mid-50s with the groomed confidence of someone who had spent decades being the most financially formidable person in any room he entered. He introduced himself as Victor Harlan and extended his hand with the smooth ease of a man who had learned that confidence was its own kind of currency. Mr. Colton, I understand you've made some interesting discoveries at the Whitmore property. Word travels, Ray said. Harlan smiled. It was a calibrated smile, warm enough to seem genuine, controlled enough to remain a tool. I'll be direct with you. I'm a property developer. I've been active in Harwick County for the past several years. I'm prepared to offer you $400,000 for the Whitmore property and all its contents. Cash. Closing within 30 days. Ray looked at him steadily. The collection has been assessed at significantly more than $400,000. Perhaps, Harlan said, but selling it yourself is complicated. Authentication processes, auction arrangements, museum negotiations. That takes time and expertise and energy that most people in your situation, a pause precise and deliberate, prefer to redirect elsewhere. Ray said he would think about it. After Harlan left, Walt Briggs set down the inventory clipboard he had been holding and looked at Ray with the expression of a man who has something to say and is deciding whether to say it. You should know something about Victor Harlan, Walt said. Ray waited. He's been buying properties in this county for 3 years. Flips some, develops others. He's effective. Walt paused. Last year, before the county put the Whitmore property up for auction, Harlan hired a firm out of Columbus to do a private assessment of the estate, paid for it himself. Our town clerk mentioned it. He had to file paperwork through the county for access to the records. Another pause. He knew what was in that house, Ray, or he suspected. He missed the auction deadline by 4 days. Ray drove back to the Whitmore mansion in a silence that was not quite anger and not quite clarity, but somewhere between the two. Harlan had not stumbled onto this opportunity. He had been pursuing it. The $400,000 offer was not generosity. It was a fraction of the assessed value from a man who had done his research and was betting that Ray's desperation was greater than his information. He had looked at Ray Colton and seen a desperate man. He had not been wrong about the desperation. He had been wrong about what it meant. Sadie arrived that Friday evening. She came in a borrowed car with her roommate Kara and a young man named Theo Alderman, a third-year architecture student with a particular quality of attention that Ray recognized immediately, the way a person looks at a building when they are genuinely trying to understand it rather than simply observe it. Theo had brought his own measuring tape. Ray liked him immediately. They worked through the weekend, cleaning, clearing, repairing. Theo helped Ray install proper glass in 2 of the ground floor windows, and the two of them fell into easy conversation about period-appropriate restoration techniques, about the relationship between structural integrity and historical accuracy, about the specific challenges of Victorian woodwork. Kara organized the makeshift living quarters in the library into something that resembled a camp rather than a collapse. Sadie worked with the focused, slightly aggressive energy of someone who needed to be useful and was not interested in being told she was doing enough. On Saturday evening, Ray took them into the hidden room. Sadie stood at the threshold for a moment before entering. Then she crossed to the desk and read silently for several minutes. Ray watched her face. She was 20 years old and she was reading a dead man's account of carrying a sleeping child to a hiding place in 1889, and whatever she felt about it moved across her face without her trying to control it. He trusted someone would come, she said finally. He kept all of this and he sealed it up and he trusted that eventually the right person would find it. She looked at Ray. Do you think you're that person? Ray did not answer immediately. I don't know yet, he said honestly. Sunday morning, Agnes Tully appeared at the front door before breakfast. She was carrying a small envelope, not a bakery offering this time, but something she held with both hands and extended to Ray with a deliberateness that made the gesture feel significant. I've been watching you, she said, since you arrived, the kind of watching you do when you are not sure yet. She pressed the envelope into his hands. I'm sure now. Inside the envelope was a letter, several pages handwritten in a careful faded script. At the top of the first page, a name and a date, Miriam Whitmore, October 3rd, 1973. Ray read it standing in the entry hall while Agnes waited. Miriam Whitmore had been a distant relation of Edmund's family, his great-grand-niece raised by a branch of the family that had maintained a complicated relationship with the Greystone Falls property across the decades of legal dispute. She had visited the mansion in the summer of 1972 alone and had found the hidden room. She had been contacted by collectors, by a museum, by a developer whose name she did not record but whose offer she described as substantial. She had refused all of them. Some things are worth more than what they can be sold for, Miriam wrote. I believe Edmund understood this. I believe whoever comes after me will understand it too. I am writing this because I want to leave them something, not just the room, but the way inside the second secret, which I found and chose to leave for the person worthy of it. The brass compass in the study desk. Press the back of it 3 times firmly. The top left drawer of the desk has a false bottom. What Edmund hid there was meant only for someone who truly understood his mission. Ray looked up from the letter. Agnes Tully was watching him with the patient expression of someone who has already decided the outcome and is simply waiting for the other party to catch up. She died in 1975, Agnes said. 2 years after she wrote that. I've had it since then. I was 24 years old when she gave it to me. She told me to wait for the right person. A pause. I've been waiting 50 years. Ray went to the study. He opened the desk drawer, took out the brass compass, turned it over in his palm, the familiar weight, the familiar engraving. True north. He pressed the back of it 3 times. The compass clicked, a small, precise sound, something released in the mechanism of the drawer itself. Ray set the compass down, opened the top left drawer of the desk. The false bottom was thin, a panel of wood fitted so precisely into the drawer's interior that it was invisible unless you knew to look for it. He lifted it out carefully. Beneath it, a collection of documents, bank certificates, investment records, land deeds, all in Edmund Whitmore's name, and all dated 1892. And beneath the documents, a letter folded sealed with red wax that had held for over a century. Ray broke the seal. To whoever finds this room and chooses preservation over profit, if you are reading this, you have made the choice. I hope someone would make. You have looked at what I built and understood why I built it. You have chosen the work over the reward. Because of this, I am entrusting you with the means to continue that work. The assets detailed in the accompanying documents are held in trust for the sole purpose of preserving this house and educating future generations about the work that was done within its walls. They are not yours to spend as you wish. They are yours to steward. Use them wisely. Use them well. The fight for justice never truly ends. It only changes form. Edmund Whitmore, September 1892. He sat down on the study floor. He sat with his back against the desk and Edmund's letter in his hands and the compass beside him, and let the full weight of the moment settle over him. The documents spread around him, detailed investments and land holdings that Edmund had set aside and structured into a trust railroad bonds property, deeds, investment certificates from institutions that had since merged and changed names a dozen times over the intervening century. He did not know what they were worth now. He did not know what had survived the years of legal dormancy and institutional change. But he knew what Edmund had done. A man who had spent his life helping people who had nothing had sat down in 1892, 5 years before his death, and set aside resources specifically for the person who would come after him. Who would find what he had built? Who would choose correctly? Who would need help to keep going? Ray picked up his phone, called Cilla Marsh. It was nearly 11 at night. She answered on the third ring, her voice carrying the particular alertness of someone who had been waiting for the phone to ring. "I found something else," Ray said. "A second compartment." Edmund left an endowment assets documents, a letter. He planned for this. He set aside resources for whoever found the room and chose to preserve it. Silence, then, "Ray, don't touch anything else tonight. I'm coming first thing in the morning." He set the phone down. Outside the study window, the September night had gone fully dark over the Whitmore property. An owl called from the tree line. The house settled with its familiar creaks and groans, the sound he had stopped hearing as alarming and had started hearing as the house talking to itself, talking to him. Ray sat on the study floor with Edmund Whitmore's letter in his hands and the brass compass beside him, and thought about a man who had been dead for 127 years and had still somehow managed to leave the light on. He thought about Sadie asking if he was the right person. He thought about Agnes Tully waiting 50 years. He turned the compass over in his palm one more time. True north. He was beginning to understand what it meant. The documents took 3 weeks to begin to understand. Cilla Marsh arrived at 7:45 the next morning with Wendell Odom, a property attorney in his early 60s, who specialized in historic estates and who looked at the contents of the false bottom drawer with the careful, unhurried attention of a man who had learned long ago that the most important thing in his profession was not speed but accuracy. Wendell spread the documents across the study desk and worked through them methodically, making notes in a small leather book, occasionally holding a page closer to the window light and reading silently for long periods without speaking. After 2 hours, he sat back and looked at Ray. "Edmund Whitmore was meticulous," Wendell said. "This trust structure for 1892 is sophisticated. He had help from a good attorney. Everything is properly executed, properly witnessed, properly recorded." He tapped the stack of documents with one careful finger. "The question is, what survived? Railroad bonds, land deeds, investment certificates. Some of these institutions still exist in successor form. Some of the land parcels are in areas that have since been developed. We need to trace every asset individually. How long will I? Weeks, possibly longer." Wendell was looked at him steadily. "But Ray, what I can tell you right now without completing the assessment is that Edmund did not leave this as a gesture. He left it as a foundation. This was planned. This was serious money set aside with serious intention." Cilla stood at the window with her arms folded and her eyes on the grounds below. "With an endowment," she said quietly, "we can actually do this. A real museum, professional staff, educational programming, permanent preservation." She turned. The Whitmore house could become one of the most significant historical sites in this region. Ray looked at the documents spread across Edmund's desk and thought about $1.13 in a parking lot and what it meant that a man dead for 127 years had looked further into the future than Ray had managed to look in the past 3 years. The news reached Victor Harlan within 48 hours. Ray did not know how. Small towns had their own information systems, permeable, efficient, operating through mechanisms that had nothing to do with technology and everything to do with the particular intimacy of people who had lived alongside each other for decades. By the time Harlan appeared at the Whitmore mansion on a Thursday afternoon, he knew about the second compartment, the endowment documents, and the preliminary assessment of their potential value. He stood on the front porch in his expensive suit and looked at Ray with an expression that had shed its earlier warmth entirely. "My offer has changed," Harlan said. $800,000. The property and all contents. Cash. You have 72 hours. Ray looked at him without speaking. "After 72 hours, Harlan continued, the offer expires, and I'll tell you what happens then. I have attorneys who specialize in historic estate law. There are legitimate questions about the chain of custody for these assets, a trust established in 1892, dormant for over a century, with documentation that has never been probated in any modern court. We can tie this up in litigation for years. A pause, precise and deliberate. Or you can take $800,000 and walk away clean. After Harlan left, Ray stood on the front porch of the Whitmore mansion and looked out over the overgrown grounds and felt something he had not expected to feel. Not fear, anger. Clean and clarifying, the kind of anger that arrives not from being threatened, but from understanding exactly what the threat reveals about the person making it. Harlan had known about this house for over a year. He had researched it, assessed it, calculated its value, missed his chance, and spent the intervening time waiting for another opportunity. He had watched Ray buy the property for $1 and had immediately begun constructing the architecture of pressure, the lowball offer, the 72-hour deadline, and now the legal threat. He had looked at Ray Colton and seen a desperate man. He had not been wrong about the desperation. He had been wrong about what it meant. Ray called Wendell Odom. Harlan is threatening litigation, claims the endowment's chain of custody is questionable. Wendell was quiet for a moment. He's not entirely wrong that there are questions, but questions aren't the same as vulnerabilities. Edmund's documentation is thorough. The trust was properly recorded. We can answer every question he raises, it just takes time and work. A pause. He's betting you won't fight him. He's betting the cost of the fight in time and stress, in uncertainty, is more than you're willing to pay. He's wrong, Ray said. Then let me do my job. That evening, Ray drove into Greystone Falls and sat in his truck outside the town hall for 20 minutes thinking about what he was about to do. Then he called Walt Briggs. Walt answered on the second ring. Ray asked if it was possible to use the town hall meeting room on short notice. Walt said he would make some calls. An hour later, Walt called back Saturday evening, 7 o'clock. The room was theirs. The meeting was Walt's doing as much as Ray's. He made calls. Scylla made calls. Agnes Tully, who had lived in Greystone Falls for over 7 decades and knew approximately everyone, made calls. By Saturday afternoon, word had moved through the town in that particular organic way, not through any single channel, but through the accumulated force of people talking to other people who talked to other people. Ray arrived at the town hall at 6:30 to find the parking lot already half full. By 7 o'clock, the meeting room held over 100 people. He had not prepared remarks. He had decided on the drive over that the only thing worth saying was the truth of all of it, without the careful management one he had maintained for months. He stood at the front of the room and looked at the assembled faces of Greystone Falls and felt the specific exposure of a man who is about to stop pretending. I want to tell you everything, he said. Not the version where I'm the clever guy who found hidden treasure. The real version. He told them about the truck, about the parking lot, about $1.13 and a cracked phone screen at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday night. He told them about driving 4 hours on no sleep and signing papers in Arthur Gaines's office and standing on the front porch of this house and seriously considering turning around. He told them about the hand pump and the cold water and the decision to stay that he still could not explain rationally. He told them about Edmund Whitmore, about the passage in the basement, in the hidden room, in the journals, in the 200 families whose names were written in Edmund's careful hand. He told them about the brass compass in Miriam Whitmore's letter and the false bottom in the desk drawer and the endowment Edmund had left for the person who would choose correctly. He told them about Victor Harlan, about the offer, about the threat. I could sell tomorrow morning, Ray said. $800,000. I could pay off every debt I have, give my daughter a future without loans, start over somewhere with enough cushion that I never sleep in a parking lot again. He paused. Part of me wants to. I want you to know that. I'm not standing here pretending this is easy. The room was quiet in the way rooms are quiet when people are genuinely listening. But Edmund Whitmore built something here. Not just a house, a place of purpose. He helped people who had nothing, who were starting over, who needed someone to believe in them. And then he spent the last years of his life making sure that the work could continue. He trusted that someone would come along who would understand what mattered more than the money. Ray looked around the room at the faces, people he had known for 3 weeks, people he was only beginning to understand. I don't want to be the person who proves him wrong. He told them about the East Wing, the structural assessment, the foundation settling, $75,000 needed within 30 days or they would lose that section of the house entirely and possibly more. I'm asking for help, he said. Not just money, though we need that too. I'm asking for this community to decide whether this place is worth fighting for, whether the story Edmund Whitmore preserved is worth preserving again. He let the silence hold for a moment. I can't promise it works out. I can promise I won't stop trying. What happened next was not dramatic. It was better than dramatic. A man in work clothes near the back of the room stood up and said his name was Lloyd Pruitt and he owned a lumberyard in the next county and he would provide material for the emergency foundation work at his cost, not retail. A woman 3 rows from the front said she was an electrical contractor and she would do the rewiring at cost and talk to her suppliers about donations. A retired carpenter offered his time. A plumbing company owner pledged labor. A high school history teacher said she would bring her classes. The owner of the diner on Main Street committed to feeding work crews on volunteer weekends. Walt Briggs, standing against the back wall with his arms folded and an expression that Ray would later describe to Sadie as fierce, said, "Whatever you need from Briggs Hardware, you've got it." Agnes Tully, seated in the second row with her hands folded in her lap, said nothing during the meeting. But when it ended and people were filing out, she pressed an envelope into Ray's hand without comment. Inside was a check for $1,000. By the end of the evening, they had pledges totaling $70,000 in poem and more than $100,000 in donated services and materials. It was not enough to solve everything, but it was enough to mean that the problem had changed shape. Ray sat in his truck into the town hall parking lot after everyone had gone and held the collection of pledge cards in both hands and felt something he recognized, the same thing he had felt at the hand pump at the compass at the moment the hidden panel swung open. Not just hope, certainty, the quiet load-bearing kind. Wendell Odom filed the motion to dismiss Harlan's challenge the following Monday. His brief was 42 pages and demonstrated with the methodical precision of a man who had spent 30 years caring about details that the Whitmore Trust had been properly maintained through every decade of the property's contested history, that the chain of custody was unbroken, and that Harlan's claims had no legitimate legal foundation. He was bluffing, Wendell told Ray. Not entirely, there were real questions he found to raise, but he was counting on the questions being enough to scare you. They're not enough to win. The structural engineer's report was not bluffing. The East Wing Foundation had settled further than the initial assessment had shown, unevenly in a pattern that indicated active movement rather than historical settling. The timeline was compressed. They had 30 days, perhaps less, before the movement became irreversible. $75,000 needed, $30,000 available in cash from the community pledges, $45,000 short with a deadline that did not negotiate. Cilla Marsh called at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday evening. "I have an idea," she said. "It's unconventional." "Tell me." "We live stream the house. You tell the story, all of it, the way you told it at the town hall. We ask for direct public support for the emergency structural work. Specific goal, specific deadline, specific consequence if we don't reach it." A pause. "It's crowdfunding, but it's also something else. It's asking people to be part of this." Ray thought about it for approximately 30 seconds. "Set it up," he said. The stream went live on a Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. Ray stood in the damaged East Wing with a tripod-mounted phone and no script, and told the story of the Whitmore mansion the way he had told it at the town hall, starting with the parking lot, ending with Edmund's letter, and leaving nothing important out. "We have 48 hours to raise $45,000, he said to the camera, to the unknown number of people watching from wherever they were. "If we don't reach that number, we lose this section of the house. We may lose more." He looked directly into the lens. "I'm not asking for this for me. I'm asking for Edmund Whitmore, who helped over 200 families that history had forgotten and who trusted 130 years ago that someone would come along and think his work was worth continuing." He paused. "I'd like to prove him right." The donations began within minutes. $5, 20, 10, 100. They came with messages. A woman in Michigan who said her family had been researching their ancestry and found a name in a digitized county record that matched something in the Whitmore journals. A retired teacher in Georgia who said she had spent 30 years trying to make history feel real to students and wanted to support a place that did it without trying. A man in Oregon who wrote only, "Some things are worth fighting for. Here's $50 toward yours." By midnight, they had raised $12,000. By the following morning, $28,000. The local news picked up the story that afternoon. A reporter drove from Columbus and filmed Ray walking through the damaged East Wing and the hidden room asking questions, but Ray answered without performance, just plainly the way you talk when you are too tired for anything but the truth. The segment aired Friday evening. Sadie drove up that afternoon without telling him she was coming. She appeared at the front door of the Whitmore mansion at 4 o'clock with Kara and Theo. And when Ray opened the door, she stepped inside and hugged him with the particular fierceness of someone who has been worried for a long time and is relieved to find the thing they were worried about still standing. They watched the news segment together on Theo's laptop, sitting on the library floor, the room where Ray had slept on his first night and which had since been transformed into something that resembled a functioning workspace. "You look like you know what you're doing," Sadie said. "I'm terrified," Ray said. "I know." She leaned her head against his shoulder briefly. "That's how I know it's real." Saturday morning, 31 hours into the 48-hour window. The total stood at $38,000, $7,000 short. Ray walked the grounds in the early morning light, the September grass wet with dew, the mansion rising behind him solid and complicated and irreplaceable. He thought about Harlan's 72 hours. He thought about Edmund's letter. He thought about the couple he had watched walking to their car in the Walmart parking lot 3 weeks ago, laughing, heading home, carrying the ordinary weight of a life that worked. He wanted that. Not wealth, not vindication, just a life with weight to it, work that mattered, a door that was his to open. His phone registered new donations throughout the day. The total climbed. 40,000, 41. The pace was slower now. The initial surge of attention was settling into a steadier current. Each dollar felt harder than the last. By 7 in the evening, they were at 43,500, 1,500 short. Harlan's deadline was 8 o'clock. The remaining 90 minutes had the quality of a held breath. Ray sat in the library with Sadie and Scylla and Walt watching the donation counter on Scylla's laptop refresh every few minutes. The number moved in small increments. $20, 50, 10. At 7:44, the total reached $44,000, 1,000 short. At 7:51, Agnes Tully's name appeared in the donor list. $1,000, 500 short. 7:56, 7:57. Small donations arriving in clusters, 10, 20, 25. People who had watched the news segment and waited until the last possible moment, or who had just found the stream, or who had been watching the counter and decided that the last push deserved their participation. 7:58, $240 short. Sadie was refreshing the page every 30 seconds. Theo stood in the doorway. Walt had his arms folded and his jaw set in the expression Ray had come to recognize as the man at his most determined. 7:59, $60 short. The donations came in amounts Ray would remember for the rest of his life. $15 from someone in Vermont, 20 from someone in New Mexico, 12 from a username that was just a string of numbers, $8.50, an oddly specific amount that made Ray think of someone emptying a change jar onto a desk. At 7:59 and 47 seconds, the total crossed $45,000. The room was silent for a moment. Then Sadie made a sound that was not quite a word and covered her mouth with both hands, and Walt said something short and emphatic that was not suitable for a museum, and Scylla set down her laptop and pressed her fingers against her eyes and breathed. Ray picked up his phone and called Victor Harlan. Harlan answered on the second ring. "We raised the money," Ray said. "The foundation work proceeds. The museum project proceeds." He paused. "The answer to your offer is no, and it will remain no. You can pursue whatever litigation you believe is worthwhile. Wendell Odom will be ready for you." A silence on the other end. "You've made a serious mistake," Harlan said. "Maybe," Ray said, "but it's mine to make." He hung up. The following morning, Ray was in the study when he heard a vehicle on the gravel drive. He looked out the window and saw a pickup truck he did not recognize. A woman climbed out in her early 40s with the careful, observant movements of someone who spent a lot of time looking at how things were built. She carried a hard-sided case and wore a jacket with a structural engineering firm's logo on the chest. Ray met her at the front door. "My name is Dr. Renata Osei," she said. She had a direct, measured manner, the kind of composure that comes not from coldness, but from long practice at remaining steady when things are not. I saw the news segment Friday evening. I'd like to offer my services for the foundation's stabilization. Pro bono. I'll supervise the work personally, and I have contractors I can bring in at cost. Ray looked at her. White height. Dr. Osi was quiet for a moment, not hesitating, choosing. My great-great-grandmother's name is in the ledger upstairs, she said. Delia Osi arrived at this house in November 1889, traveling with her husband and their infant daughter. Edmund Whitmore gave them shelter provisions and safe passage north. They settled in Cleveland. Their daughter grew up, became a school teacher, raised 4 children of her own. She paused. I am here because Edmund Whitmore opened his door on a November night in 1889. He kept a record of it. You preserved that record. She looked at the mansion behind him. Let me return what was given. Ray stood in the doorway of the Whitmore mansion and did not speak for a long moment. He thought about Edmund in 1892 sitting at the desk in the hidden room, setting aside assets and writing a letter to a person he would never meet. He thought about Miriam Whitmore in 1973 writing instructions for a stranger she trusted would eventually come. He thought about Agnes Tully holding that letter for 50 years. He thought about a compass engraved with 2 words and what those words had come to mean to him across 3 months of a life rebuilt from nothing. Thank you, Ray said. Please come in. The foundation work took 6 weeks. Dr. Osei and her crew worked methodically, excavating carefully around the compromised sections of the East Wing foundation, installing steel reinforcement, pouring new concrete in stages to avoid disturbing the existing structure. Ray worked alongside them when he was not needed elsewhere, learning techniques he had read about, but never personally executed his architect's knowledge, meeting the practical reality of hands in the ground. Volunteers continued to arrive throughout October and into November. Some came for a day, some stayed for a week. They cleared, repaired, painted, rebuilt. The mansion's ground floor was transformed slowly from a ruin into a space that suggested for the first time what it might eventually become. Walt Briggs organized the volunteer crews with the focused efficiency of a man who had spent 30 years running a hardware store and understood the relationship between materials, sequence, and competent people working in the right order. Scylla managed the grant applications and historical commission paperwork and the 100 administrative details that turned a vision into a registered nonprofit with a functioning operational structure. Wendell Odom filed the final documentation for the Whitmore Trust in November. After 6 weeks of research tracing assets across a century of corporate mergers, property transfers, and institutional changes, the endowment had been fully verified. 3 land parcels in developed areas of Columbus valued at current market rates. Railroad bond successor certificates from 2 companies that had merged into a larger line. Investment records traced through 4 generations of institutional inheritance. Total verified endowment value $550,000. Structured for annual distribution, managed by the nonprofit, sufficient to fund the museum's operations, maintain the property, and support educational programming indefinitely, provided the organization was run with the careful stewardship Edmund had specified in his letter. Wendell called Ray on a Wednesday afternoon to give him the final number. Ray was on the mansion's roof patching a section of missing shingles in the November cold when the call came. He sat on the roof with the phone against his ear and looked out over the grounds of the Whitmore property, the overgrown fields beginning to show the first effects of the volunteer clearing, with the tree line in the distance, the town of Greystone Falls visible as a cluster of rooftops and a single church steeple 3 miles to the southwest. It's enough, Wendell said. It's exactly what he intended it to be. Enough to continue the work, not enough to become comfortable. He was a precise man. Ray looked at the view from the roof of a house he had bought for $1. He said, the opening of the Whitmore House Museum and Education Center was scheduled for the 2nd Saturday in June, 9 months after Ray had placed his bid on a website that looked like it had been built in 2003 and never updated. The renovation was not complete. The 3rd floor remained closed, and several rooms still needed work that would take another season to address properly. But the ground floor had been restored with the kind of careful attention that honored the original craftsmanship without pretending the house had not aged. The hidden room had been transformed into a climate-controlled gallery, the Freedom Room as the Historical Commission had officially designated it, its journals displayed in museum-grade cases, The artwork properly lit the documents accessible to researchers through a digital archive that Scylla had spent months building with support from the university. Ray woke early on the morning of the opening. He had moved into the renovated guest wing of the mansion 3 months earlier, a modest apartment carved out of what had once been the servants' quarters on the second floor. A bedroom, a sitting room, a kitchenette, nothing excessive, everything sufficient. His. He stood at the window in the early June light and looked out at the grounds which had been cleared and seeded and were showing the first real growth of the season. He dressed carefully in the suit Sadie had insisted on, dark gray, properly fitted, sourced from a Columbus thrift store on a Saturday in April when she had refused to let him leave until they found something that worked. He walked through the mansion one last time before visitors arrived. Every room held something now. Not just objects, but context, explanation, connection. The entry hall had interpretive panels describing Edmund Whitmore's history and the house's architectural significance. The parlor was restored to period-appropriate arrangement, its furniture sourced from regional estate sales and carefully vetted for accuracy. The library had become a reading room where researchers could access reproductions of the archive. The Freedom Room was the heart of the museum, the space around which everything else oriented. Ray stood in the Freedom Room in the early morning quiet and read the same journal entry he had read on the first morning he had stepped inside, the one about the Morrison family and the youngest child who had fallen asleep at the kitchen table. What we do in darkness, history will judge in light. Scylla found him there at 9 o'clock. There's already a line, she said. By 10 o'clock, the lawn in front of the Whitmore mansion held over 300 people. By the time Ray stepped onto the front porch at 11 for the opening remarks, the number had grown past 400. He saw faces he recognized: Walt Briggs, uncomfortable in a dress shirt but grinning broadly; Agnes Tully in the front row, wearing what Ray suspected was her best coat; Dr. Renata Osei standing at the edge of the crowd with her arms folded and the expression of someone quietly completing a transaction that has been open for a very long time. Sadie stood in the front row beside Kara and Theo, who had spent so many weekends at the Whitmore mansion over the past months that he had effectively become a permanent member of the restoration team. He and Sadie stood close to each other in the easy way of people who have stopped pretending they are not standing close on purpose, and Ray observed this with the quiet, appreciative attention of a father who has learned the value of minding his own business at exactly the right moments. Scylla stood beside Ray and extended the scissors. "The honor is yours," she said. Ray stepped to the ribbon stretched across the front entrance of the house. He looked at the crowd, at the house behind him, at the grounds that had been reclaimed from neglect and were now, on this June morning, genuinely beautiful in the particular way of old things that had been given back their dignity. "I bought this house for $1, he said. His voice was steady. "I was sleeping in my truck. I had $1, 13 in my bank account, and no particular reason to believe that things were going to improve. I placed a bid because I had $1 and nothing to lose, and because there was something in a photograph of an old building that looked like it was still trying to be what it had been built to be." He paused. "I found more here than I knew how to look for. I found Edmund Whitmore's work, 200 families documented with care, preserved with faith, that someone would eventually come and understand why the record mattered. I found a community that decided this story was worth fighting for. I found people who gave their time and their skills and their money because they believed that what Edmund built here had meaning not just as history, but as instruction, as proof that one person with resources and the willingness to use them for others can leave something that outlasts them by over a century and still speaks clearly." He looked at the ribbon. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you I'm worthy of that legacy. I'm going to tell you I'm going to spend the rest of my time in this house trying to be." He looked at Sadie briefly, found her eyes, and looked back at the crowd. "That's the best any of us can do." He cut the ribbon. The doors opened. The crowd moved inside, and Ray stood on the porch and watched them go. Families, researchers, children, elderly, visitors who had grown up hearing about this house and were seeing its interior for the first time. He watched a woman stop in the entry hall and look up at the carved banister and press her hand against her mouth. He watched a group of students crowd around the interpretive panel in the parlor, one of them pointing at something and asking a question, with the particular intensity of someone encountering a fact that has changed the shape of something they thought they understood. He watched Walt Briggs pretend to study the architectural details of the doorframe, while actually watching the people moving through with an expression of unconcealed satisfaction. Agnes Tully appeared beside him on the porch. Miriam would be proud, she said. So would Edmund. I hope so, Ray said. Agnes looked at him with the directness she had maintained since the evening she had arrived with bread and the stated intention of watching him to see what kind of man he was. You earned it, she said simply. Not by finding it, by choosing correctly when you found it. Those are different things. He knew she was right. He had understood for some time that the finding had been luck, the particular luck of a desperate man with $1 and a cracked phone screen and a late night with nothing left to lose. But the choosing had been something else. The choosing had been his. Toward the end of the afternoon, a woman approached him near the entrance to the Freedom Room. She was in her 60s, well-dressed, holding the museum's printed program with both hands. Her eyes were red in the way that happens when someone has been crying quietly and trying not to show it. My great-great-grandfather's name is in there, she said. She did not need to specify where it booked. James Whitfield. He came through this house in 1886. I've been researching my family history for 15 years and I could never find what happened to him between Georgia and Cleveland. She paused. It's in the journal, all of it. Edmund wrote about him for 2 pages. She gripped the program tighter. Thank you. Thank you for preserving this. Thank you for giving my family back a piece of ourselves we didn't know we'd lost. Ray did not have words for that moment. He nodded and held her gaze and let it be what it was. After the last visitors departed and the volunteer staff had finished their closing procedures and the grounds had gone quiet in the long June evening, Ray sat alone in the Freedom Room. The display cases held Edmund's journals and climate-controlled preservation. The artwork hung properly lit on the restored walls. The room that had been sealed for over a century now had visitors who came to understand what had happened within it and would continue to have them. Ray sat in the small chair in the corner, not Edmund's desk, which was preserved behind a low barrier, but a chair he had placed there himself in the early weeks when he had spent evenings in this room reading and thinking and trying to understand what he had been given. He had a journal of his own now, a simple composition book he had started the previous winter. He opened it to a clean page. He thought about what he wanted to say. He had received an email that week from a man named Daniel Whitmore in Philadelphia, Edmund's great-great-great-nephew who had found the museum through a genealogy research project and written with the slightly formal courtesy of someone making contact across a distance they are not sure will be welcomed. He had letters, he said, photographs, small items from the family history that he believed belonged in the house. He had read about the museum and wanted to visit in the fall and bring what he had. The circle, Ray thought, kept expanding. Every time he thought it had found its edge, it grew. He put the pen to the page. 9 months ago, he wrote, I placed $1 bet on a house I had never seen in a town I had never visited because I was sitting in a parking lot in the dark and I needed to believe that something could still go differently than it had been going. He paused, listening to the house settle around him, the familiar language of old timber that he had learned to understand the way you learn to understand any voice you live with long enough. I did not know then that the house was already waiting for me, that a man who had been dead for 127 years had planned for this moment, had set aside resources, written letters, built hidden rooms, with the specific faith that someone would eventually come along who needed what this place had to offer, who would look at what he had preserved and understand why he had preserved it, who would choose the work over the reward. I did not know that the $1 I spent was not buying a house. It was buying an introduction to a version of myself I had not been able to find. He looked up at the display cases, at Edmund's handwriting visible through the glass, precise and clear after all these years. What we do in darkness history will judge in light. Ray looked back at his journal. I don't know who will read this, he wrote. Maybe no one. Maybe someday someone will find it the way I found Edmund's journals in a house that held on to things because it understood that things are worth holding on to. If that's you, the work is ongoing. The doors are open. Whatever you came here carrying, set it down for a while and look around. He paused. Rock bottom has a trap door. I know because I found mine. It opens downward, but it leads somewhere. The compass still sits on the desk in the study. I look at it every morning before I start the day. 2 words on the back of a piece of brass that a man engraved in the 1880s and left in a drawer for someone he would never meet. True north. I finally know where that is. He closed the journal. Outside, the June evening had gone the color of copper over the Whitmore grounds. The house stood solid around him, imperfect, still unfinished in the way that things built for the long term are always unfinished, carrying its age visibly and without apology. The Freedom Room held its quiet. The journals rested in their cases. The names of 200 families waited in Edmund's careful handwriting for the next person who needed to know they were there. Ray Colton, 48 years old, architect curator, once homeless now, Holmes sat in the house he had bought for $1 and listened to it breathe, and felt in the particular quiet of a thing completed and a thing begun, the solid and unmistakable weight of exactly where he was.